Hello. Good afternoon. Nice to see everyone. Again, apologies about the extenuating circumstances around the slight delay here. Just going to hit a go button because we have a fun little lecture today. Yu Chao has asked me to, normally like in previous terms we might not always have this lecture, but Yu Chao's asked me to come by today and basically spend as much time with you as you would like talking about iteration 2, which is due tomorrow, right? Now, we did get some questions from people in the, how would you put it, like the survey. I think Yu Chao sent out a survey about iteration 2. But a lot of the questions there weren't many questions, and some of them were very hard for us to form a basis. A good example for you was one question we got was like, can we do more with HTTP servers, right? And those questions are tricky because, you know, we did a whole lecture on it and we teach you everything we think you need to know. So we would just say, you know, go and refer to that lecture, basically. So I do need a little bit of input from people here today, either online or if you're in person, you can again contribute to the Slido. It's a funny video. So we got 16 people online and we got, I don't know, 30 people here. So I would largely like to be led by you today in terms of what we cover, because we're kind of back to regular content next week. And we will just go for the entire time till 4 p.m. until we run out of questions that people have to ask. So if you are tuning in online or you're here, I know you all don't seem to like the Slido very much this term. I am conscious too that, you know, Thursday afternoon, there's going to be a somewhat limited amount of questions that people might have to ask as well, because by now you've probably kind of gotten a grasp on a lot of stuff. And I imagine if you're someone who's completely screwed for iteration 2, you're probably not in the room right now as well. So yeah, would anyone like to start us off? Yeah.
So for session ID, can there be 2 session IDs per UID?
Okay, so the question was, for a session ID, can there be 2 session IDs per user ID? Let's unpack that a little bit. So what do you mean by like, can there be 2? Do you mean like, can like a user have 2 sessions at the same time?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of why we do that, basically, because it allows you to kind of, so to speak, log in many different sessions and log them out kind of independently. And again, a recap for anyone else who is curious, that goes back to what we talked about, how like you can log into Netflix on your laptop, and then you can log in on your phone, and then you can log out on your phone, but you're still logged in on your laptop because Netflix is tracking sessions that you're logged in with. Yep.
I was experimenting with the front end.
Yep.
And I noticed there was no like front end display for quiz info.
There was no front end display for quiz info.
There's like a quiz list section, but there's like no quiz info section.
Yeah, there might just not be potentially. I think the front end was kind of meant to include a lot of stuff, but yeah, I wouldn't be too worried if it's not there, at least. I'm not 100% sure. I know that a couple of groups do have the oddball little issue with the front end, which is worth kind of pointing out, because most of you, put your hand up if you've spent a lot of time with the front end so far. Yeah, very few of you, right? And typically what we see with groups is that it's a Friday problem. You know, like right now you're trying to just get things going. There's no point checking the front end if you don't feel finished. And people start checking it tonight and tomorrow. And you might find, particularly on the latter end of things, that there's a little bug or two. I think what I want to highlight with the front end, because this comes up every term, is that we do give you marks for it working with the front end. You know, your tutor does want to see you work with it, but it's not an exhaustive thing. Like at the end of the day, the auto marking, you know, and the leaderboards and all that, like they help you. Like what we tell your tutors to do is to basically, hey, can you just like register someone, log out, log in, create a quiz, add a couple questions, delete a question, that's it, you know? So if you do, like, so that's just an important thing, because what I don't want any groups stressing is that, you know, on the Friday night, like there's like one random part of the front end that doesn't work and you're worried that the tutor's going to like hone in on that, etc. Like when we ask your tutors to mark you for the front end, we literally give them like a grade scale of like a 1, 2, or 3 out of 3 kind of thing, you know, so it's quite light. So don't stress too much about that. But it's a good question for the forum too about whether it's there. I'm not sure if quiz info's there or not. The front end was kind of built to be played, so there's a chance.
On a quiz and it just shows the name and the description, like nothing else.
It's probably likely that the API has been called, but it just wasn't displayed on the page. That's a great question. We got one question come in from Ghosted Blade. Ghosted Blade has said, I was told on the forums that session IDs are returned as a string instead of a number in the TypeScript file and the server. Is that right? Firstly, it's a broad question. I wouldn't say that's right from the little I read there, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what type your sessions are as long as they are stringifiable, right? Because they need to be, like, everything's returned as JSON. So whether your token is a floating point, an integer, a Boolean, which wouldn't make any sense, or anything like that, as long as it can be turned into JSON, then it's totally fine. The session IDs can be, like, obviously the session ID becomes a string once it's JSONified, but like everything in JSON's a string, right? Like JSON can represent strings and numbers as a string and then decode them back into those strings and numbers. So no, I don't think that the session ID has to be a string. Some people will make it a string, some people won't, you know. There's a lot of variance there. Because like some groups do lots of things differently, right? Like some groups will have users and those users will be an array where each user, you know, each item in the array has a list of sessions. You know, and that will contain session IDs like this. That's not code that will work, right? But they might do something like that. Other groups will do something where they not only have their users array, but they also have their sessions array where all that does is store session IDs alongside it. And each session ID is you know, stored as like a key value pair where a session ID maps to a user ID or contains, you know, whether it's like logged in as well. There's lots of different ways you can do that. So, you know, some groups will end up storing session IDs as strings because they're actually storing session IDs as keys in objects. And other groups will store them as numbers because they're storing them as a list of, like if they're numbers, you're going to store them by numbers generally, unless you store them as keys and then you store them as strings. But it doesn't really matter in the end. Both of those things are totally fine. It's up to you. Bit of creativity. Cool, let's keep the gravy train going. Oh no, the webcam. Okay. Yeah.
The session IDs have been recycling them. So say if the user logged out and then logged in, to introduce session ID 0, for example. So is that allowed, or do we have to continue creating?
Yeah, so the question was, I've been recycling session IDs. So if I give a session ID of 0, 1, 2, 3, and then I get rid of session ID 0, I go give it to someone else. That's totally fine. Really open-ended implementation. Ways you can do it are kind of like the two ways we would probably see it done most often would be people either store a session ID along with some information like whether it's valid or not. So you'll have like a valid that's true or false, and a session ID will be a number. And that number, once you've given that session to that user, that ID is forever with that user, full stop. You'll never use that session ID again. And then another way people will do it is will just have a list of session IDs, and when someone logs out, they might just delete the session ID. And then at that point, whether they never use the session ID again or reuse it, doesn't really matter, because the lack of existence of it is kind of what denotes that they were logged out. So that's totally fine. No issues with that at all. So lots of, what is with this thing? Strange. Yeah, session IDs. I guess people are spending some time with them, which is good. Out of curiosity, did groups generally do that stuff last? Like, did you just kind of go forward with the auth user ID stuff till the end, or did you jump straight in with it? Jump straight in with the session. Yeah, cool. That's good. That's good. All right. If I could ask, yeah, there you go.
Hi, sorry, I have another question. So for the question routes,
Yes.
update question, delete quiz question, all those related ones.
Yep.
For most of them, when you run it, it will update the time last edited for the quiz.
Yes.
It says it in the Swagger file, but for delete question, it doesn't mention update the time last edited. And so my teammate was wondering if he should update it or not. And he asked on the forum, and the tutor said it was like undefined behavior. Do what you want. We're kind of not sure how to interpret.
Yeah. So when something's undefined behavior, it just means that no one has actually sat down and said this is exactly what goes wrong. The earliest example of undefined behavior is in C. You can dereference a pointer that you freed, but C doesn't actually specify what will happen if you do that. It could segfault, it could this, it could that. It basically says like, because it's something that we don't care about because you shouldn't be doing it, we're not going to define it, right? Because otherwise we just have to define a million things. Now in the case of this project, because there's a million little edge cases, right? And that's a more reasonable edge case that most groups come across. It's not something super obscure. But undefined behavior in the context of this course basically means that there is no test that is in the auto marker that would ever delete something and then check what the edited timestamp is, right? Very rarely we have an instance where like there's a mismatch between the spec and the auto marker, maybe one random thing a term, but it's really uncommon. But yeah, that's basically what it says. So it says like if you delete it and you update the edited timestamp, doesn't matter because we're not going to check. And if you don't delete it, if you delete it and you don't update it, doesn't matter because we're not going to check, right? Because there are bounds to what the auto marker does. So this next question, can we add more tests for functions even if they aren't specified in the Swagger file? Okay, so I'm just going to assume from my experience that this question is about wanting to further improve the correctness of your program, right? Like check more edge cases. Like what happens if someone passes in like a million length not a password, like a, I don't know, description. I think we cap most of those things, but sometimes you want to make your software more robust. So if you want to add tests that we don't kind of specify a part of the requirements, what I'd say to you is firstly, probably no need, go do something else with your time. But if you'd like to, you can. However, there's a caveat, which is that there are times occasionally where extra tests or extra constraints you put on will cause you to lose some auto marks. But if they're just because of extra tests, the tutors usually let you delete your tests and run it again for free, if that makes sense. An example that we might have used to have in the past was like, let's say, I don't think there's a minimum length on the password, right? I think it's like 8 characters or 12 characters or something. I don't think there's a maximum length, is there? No, so a group will think, oh, well, there's a problem maybe like what we don't want really long passwords or something, or we don't want passwords that are just password, password, password. So they add an extra test and a constraint. So they add a test in to make sure the passwords aren't terrible, and then they add implementation in to make their passwords aren't terrible. A good idea in principle, even though no one, asks you for it. No one's going to be mad at you, but what it can mean is, maybe the tutor who wrote the auto marker did actually write a test where they passed in a 100-character string. And it actually therefore fails your implementation. So in a way, it's not actually so much the tests that you write that are bad. It's like some groups add extra implementation that aren't required, and it can break your code with the auto marker. But because you've gone and tried to add extra on top of things, if a tutor saw that and was like, oh, you just kind of went too far, and you were like, yeah, we know this wasn't a requirement. We just thought it was like a good thing to do. They will let you delete it and rerun it and get the marks that you lost back. So don't be too stressed if you are feeling like going above and beyond. We try and be lenient about that. Yeah. In regards to runs, yep.
So how do we order routes so that there isn't any conflicts? So like because it's first come first serve, right? So like say we have slash create and then slash wildcard whose ID, and then slash create slash trash or something.
Yeah.
Like how do you prevent these kind of collisions?
Tell me more about the collision. So like wouldn't, if you just created a quiz and then trashed it?
Like when you have 2 URLs,
Yeah.
so one has a wildcard in it, whereas the other doesn't. So like in one case where you have
Oh, I think I follow. Let me just check. Let me pull up the Swagger. We can have a look at it. Is an example like trash and trash empty? Or something? Or
It's one example would be slash trash, and what was the one I think was slash
is the cases with wildcards that are concerning?
yeah. So like if you ordered the URLs in the given order here, then in some cases when you call URLs ordered in two, then instead call one to one.
Yeah, so I'd say as a general rule, when you're defining URLs, that you know, like some examples are like, there are cases where maybe it's not the best case, but say this URL here, if you were to call v1 admin quiz slash, right? In certain scenarios, I'd have to play with it myself. Express might interpret this as you trying to, maybe not post. Usually the delete, get, and post stuff separated out. But let's imagine these were both post requests for a second, where you just had like post quiz and then you had post quiz ID. In those cases, sometimes Express will interpret this URL as a quiz ID of null. You know, how we get around that is we generally define the if there's ever duplication, we define the wildcards at the end. So if I was writing that out, I'd be writing like v1 admin quiz, and then I do the next route v1 admin quiz quiz ID like that. Because if you put the wildcards first, then it will capture everything, including like a null case. Whereas if you put it second, you kind of deal with the concrete cases first, and then like the catch-alls after. I don't know if that's what you were talking about though.
Yeah. So further, say if we have like back to the example that you had.
Yep.
So if we had quiz slash quiz ID slash description. So.
Yep.
And the original one W slash description. So because both have wildcards, how would you prioritize the one with the earlier wildcard, or like?
You would probably prioritize the one that felt more concrete, like in this case, I would guess. In reality, it probably doesn't come up much because, again, this one would be like a put and this one would be like a get or something, which would help totally separate it out. But yeah, if they were of the same HTTP method, I would probably always start with the more concrete ones first, just because Express will have an easier time matching it, if that makes sense. It's a good question, though. There's been a few fiddly bugs in previous terms people have had with that stuff.
So would you say like a general thing is like to just in our server to just group requests of the same type together, just to avoid anything like this happening?
I mean, the ordering, okay, so like how should we order, you know, routes, basically? I probably wouldn't try and order routes by like HTTP method as much as I'd probably focus on like their logical, like just the concept of it, right? So as an example here, register, login, and logout are pretty tightly coupled. They happen to all be post requests, sure, but like they're all to do with logging in and logging out. And then you'd probably have stuff to do with, you know, editing the user, and then you'd have stuff to do with, you know, creating and modifying a quiz, and then you'd have stuff to do with, you know, working with the question of a quiz. You know, so like you could kind of break it up into concepts, and that's probably the easiest way to group things. I haven't actually heard any conversations of tutors ever being like, I took marks off a group because of how they ordered their routes. I've never heard of that. I'm not saying it's never happened. I can't imagine it would have, but yeah, if you were trying to do it, because you think about a reader, like a reader's trying to figure out, okay, this are these kinds of routes and those kinds of routes typically, more than the methods. But that's a good question as well. More questions for the Slido or the YouTube? Who's working hard on iteration 2 right now? When's it due this term? UCHR, I can't remember when UCHR made it due. Yeah, Friday, what time? Yeah, make sure you get it right, I guess. 8 something. I have no idea this term. Yeah, maybe. Usually we don't have late penalties in the course, but because we try and get them tutors marking it ASAP, because the tutors mark this quite often on the weekend, just because we something I've been a big fan of in the course is just trying to get marks back really quick. I don't know if some of you have had courses where they take like 2 or 3 weeks to get marks back. It's just really annoying with trimesters because the term's over in a flash. Did you have a question? If you didn't, that's okay. Okay. Is it to do specifically with your work? Yeah, no, that's a great point, because we do get this sometimes. Like if you have questions about your code specifically, help sessions are a great thing for it, because they can sit down with your code and help you out for sure. We should have a few help sessions on today and tomorrow, at least, I imagine. They're very late. Yeah, sure. Yeah, they are quite late in the evening sometimes. They're hard to schedule with tutors. Do people prefer online help sessions or in-person help sessions?
I think online's more convenient, but it's always better to do something in person. It's much easier.
So it's like in person if it works really well with the timetable. Yeah, but if you're at home and there's a help session on campus, you're not going to come in for it. Oh, you probably would. Okay, that's good. Okay, I got another question come up on the Slido. In question duplicate, let's go find it. Am I staring at? Oh, at the bottom. Okay. In question duplicate, it doesn't ask for total quiz time, but for other quiz functions restricts total quiz time to less than 3 minutes. Should we check that? Should we check for that in duplicate? Okay, so what this is saying is that when someone updates this quiz, if once this question was updated, the sum of the question durations in the quiz exceeds 3 minutes, then it should fail. But in quiz duplicate, that is clearly not referenced. So if you have a quiz where all the questions sum up to be 2 minutes and 59 seconds in duration, and then someone duplicates a question, there's nothing in the spec here that says that that should be an error. Now, the reason we have some stuff around underprime behavior is because, unless I've missed it, I think this is trying to remember, first, second, third, fourth. You're like the 4th cohort of students to do this project. So you're in the like 2,000th to 3,000th student to do this project. And I don't think I've had anyone point that out yet that I've seen, right? So there's these myriad of little kind of edge cases that we just don't see, and sometimes it takes terms to come up, and that's very astute of whichever one of you that is, to identify that. But the good news is that because it's not written in the spec, what that literally means is the person who wrote the spec didn't think of that, and the person who wrote the auto marking hasn't checked that, right? Because when they write the auto marking, they literally write it based on the spec, just like you do, right? Like the auto marking is just a bunch of jest tests that gets improved on every term. So should we check for that? Doesn't matter is the short answer. That's something that will end up probably in the spec next term, because a student highlighted it this term and another auto mark gets added in next term. But for this term, no, you don't need to check that because it's not required in the spec. And again, good spot on that one. Could make a very long quiz that way, I guess. Yep.
This is more of an iteration 3 question.
Yep. Iteration 3 question. Sure.
So in iter 1 to iter 2, we had to convert functions to URL calls and stuff like that. So is there anything we should expect that we have to convert from 2 to 3? Or is
It's a good question. So it's a question about iteration 3, which is relevant because it comes out on like Saturday or something, and I think my last full week of time with you is next week. So we do talk about it next week, but no, it's nowhere near that kind of jump for sure. Because so iteration 2 is a migration headache, right? You got to think about TypeScript, you got this linting thing, you got to think about the HTTP part. The best and worst part about iteration 3 is that it's just straight into doing more, right? So the iteration 3 spec, the routes are generally a little harder, and you have to do some extra stuff on the side. But largely, thankfully, there's no more tooling changes. It's just same server, same linting, same testing. You just got to get more of it done. I often describe it, because how many of you here studied in Australia for high school? Yeah, like, you know, enough, half or something. I describe it a lot as like iteration 1's like year 10, and iteration 2 is like year 11, and iteration 3 is like year 12. It's like iteration 3 is harder than iteration 2, right? By virtue of the fact that it's like the next stage up. But the jump in difficulty is like that year 10 to 11 stage, right? Which is like iteration 1 to 2. So it will be harder iteration 3. You look back at iteration 2 and be like, oh, that was easier now that I think about it. But that step change where you feel the weight of what you're doing, you know, change will be less, and you'll feel a lot more probably in control with it, which is a good thing, because a lot of groups do procrastinate iteration 2 because it's unfamiliar and no one wants to do the work, and then flex week comes up and that slows everyone down. And that's what I'd probably implore a lot of you to do is, by now you're in your groups, you're super settled, you know each other, you figured things out. So when iteration 2 comes out on the weekend, whether it's the bloody weekend or whether it's early next week, just sit down and start it. Like you will 100% just be able to start it first day as much as you want to. And that's great, because in a course like this without an exam, you can very comfortably just have a very cruisy last few weeks in the course, if that makes sense. But only if you get stuck in early-ish. That was a bit of a ramble, but I think I answered.
What my group has done, it was like iteration 2 was such a big jump up that we were like, oh my god, what do we do? So
Yeah.
it took a long time to kind of get started and you know, start moving people along.
Yeah, exactly, for sure. And like one thing that we found years ago was, because you know that annoying lab 5 that's due on a Saturday, is it? Yeah, it's like, we used to have lab 5 due on week 7 Monday, right? Like every lab is due like the following Monday. We can't make anything due in week 6, so we made it due in week 7. And we found that of all the things we did, that was actually one of the biggest impacts, because when the lab on HTTP servers wasn't due till week 7, no one felt motivated to go and learn it till week 7, because week 5 they were busy, and flex week they, you know, were like, I'll worry about it later. So that got brought forward so that everyone kind of hit flex week being like, okay, I've worked with the server before, now we can start it. So it's a very bittersweet thing, because we kind of hate doing that, right? Because no one likes the lab due on a Saturday. We'd love to make it due on a Friday, but who's in a Friday class here? Is anyone in a Friday class? Do we have Friday classes this time? They don't come to campus? I don't know. Do we? You got me curious now. Someone here knows and they just don't want to talk. Yay. Statistically, there's got to be a couple of you here, maybe. No, like, it's really mean for Friday classes. We'd love for that to be due on a Friday, but like, we don't really want people to like turn up to a lab for that week and then be like, you got 6 hours till it's due. It's a little bit mean. 2 questions. I'll start with you. Yeah.
Can you just write some code about new iteration to this those parts?
Which part of iteration 2?
New.
The new part?
Yes. Because in my group we're still only do one function in this.
Your group's only done one function of this stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. So you want to write a function for one of the new routes in iteration 2.
No, because I have no idea about how to start about the new part. So.
Yeah, okay, it's a good question. I'll try my best to, it's much easier to do with code that exists, but I can't show you code that exists because that's like students' code. But what I'd say is like, if like maybe a question is, like, so iteration 2, the using iteration 1 part says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's like 12 routes. So let's just imagine this is our server.ts file for a second. Does your server.ts right now have a bunch of things like app.post, v1 admin, auth register? Does it have a bunch of stuff like this? Like, do you have routes for each of these? Yeah, so your let's imagine for a second that your server.ts file looks like this, where there's another, those two, and then another 9, and then maybe we have like app.delete v1 clear, right? Like this. And all of those do stuff. Now, if you've done this kind of fairly standard, you've probably also got like something up here like import clear from other, and you've probably got something like admin auth register, admin auth login from auth. Where in this function here, you do something with clear, and here you do something with admin auth register, and this one you do something with the login. And that's probably after you've also got something that's like a, email equals request dot body dot email like this, and you've again at the end got your return response dot JSON stuff in there. Does that look similar to what your group's done? So the good thing is your question about like, can we do one of the new routes? It's actually quite straightforward, because let's say for a second I'm doing admin auth logout, right? What I do is I can just go find another post request that I like, say this one, and I will just go and grab it, and I would just go and paste it here, and I would just change that to be, admin auth logout, and then that function's going to need to, that route is going to need to call a function. Maybe that function's called admin auth logout, and all I'm going to do is then open another file, my auth.ts file, and I'm going to go write another function there to do that for me. And then I'll go and import that one alongside it. So when it comes to adding these new functions, you're just kind of literally doing the exact same thing as the other iteration 2 ones, where you add another route, and that route at some point probably calls an underlying function that you've written in another file, and you're just kind of expanding that out that way. I hope that was helpful. I know it's hard because it's all kind of pseudocode and stuff, but is that getting you on the right track, or is there still some confusion there? Okay. Well, if you think about other stuff, feel free to just ask as well. You had a question too.
So I'm curious on I think I skipped a few lectures before.
Yep.
How do you like do routing for query and for path?
How do you do routing for query and routing for path? That's a good question. So basically, we've got, I'll just copy and paste these. We have 4 scenarios, and I can show you them really quickly. We've got our gets, post, put, delete. Maybe I'll put the delete and the get together. Now the quick summary again with all of these is every single type of these functions here, they all return response.json something, right? They all do that. Where they differ is how they take in information. All of app.get, delete, post, and put will all take in information from the path if you want them to. For instance, if I want to take in a variable called info there, if I want to take in a variable called info, then I can say, well, const info equals request dot path dot info, like that. And in all of those cases, I can capture that from the URL if I'd like to. Where they differ, though, is that get and delete will then only also capture extra information from the query. Say someone goes and puts a name in a query, such as foo bar, the info might be like cat, and then they'll say name equals Hayden, like that. So that's how these ones get their information from the URL query. And then post and put, they can also actually get stuff from the query, but as a general rule, they're more likely to get something from the body, which is hard to kind of show you visually because you typically do it through like a ARC or Postman or something like that to send it through. So in some ways it's kind of manageably straightforward because they all return JSON. They can all take the path element in that URL. It's just get and delete and put and post, do query and body. And you can have as many things in this path as you want, like info2, info3. I could do this if I wanted to, and then I could capture them all separately. So if I could have like info there, and then I could be like, yep, well, I've also got info 2 and info 3. So you can capture as much of that path information as you'd like to. You're thinking hard, so tell me what's on your mind.
So, when do you get like bar and you get the cat question mark?
Oh, cat. I mean, in this case, cat would be the info. Like, if I passed in cat, then this would be cat in this case. Because these URL paths, they literally just like, what they try and do is they see a URL that's called, and then they try and see if like this URL would match what was called. So if someone like if someone made a call to like foobar ABC, they'd be like, oh, I can deal with that because I can do foobar and then 3 variables. But if someone did this one, they'd be like, I can't process that because I'm only expecting foobar and then 3 variables, not 6. And similarly, it wouldn't process, I don't think it would process that either. I could be wrong, but yeah, so it's just string matching basically. Query and path are not the same, because if I wanted to pass in, say, name and age, be a good example here. Let's say I want to pass name and age here. What I could do is pass age through the query and name through the path, and it would look like this. Foobar Hayden, age equals 18, like that. That's how it will come through. Correct. Yep. Query doesn't have to be part of the route definition, because everything, like in the world of the web, this is the path of the web page, and the question mark separates the path from the query string, we called it, which is that second half. Yeah, so for testing, I mean, this is, let's see if I can find it quickly. So if we come all the way to the end, so here, if you wanted to test it, if you wanted to put some information in the path, you would literally just put it in the path like a string, right? So if you wanted to call, foobar A, B, C, or whatever, you would just write it there. For the query string, that question mark part after, you could also actually manually put it in the URL too. You could just write it in or code it in somehow. And by that I mean you could literally be like, yeah, I want you to call foobar, name question mark age equals age, right? Like you could handle the string just like that with JavaScript variables. Or the sync request library has a great feature to it where you can actually say, I want to call that path, but then you give it this query string parameter where you actually just give it the properties. And this library will take whatever's in the query string object and go and jam it in the URL for you automatically. And this is great because it means like when you're doing testing, whether you're doing get, put, post, or delete, you can always do the same thing where you write your path and then you go and put either your query string or your body there, and you can just treat it like a normal object. So it's a pretty elegant way of doing it.
Can you also put the path inside the queue?
No, the path has to be here. Like this is the, like, again, in the world of web, every page you access has a URL, which includes a domain and a path, or a domain port and path. That's the address. That's like the mailing address. That always has to be like defined like that. The query string and body are kind of like metadata, extra things added onto the end. So yeah, you'd always have to put the path in that there. Yeah, good questions though. So. All right, we've got a few questions. Should persistence only be added in the function implementations like admin auth register, or do we also call it in the server file after the server starts and before it closes? So We talked about this in week 5, something like that. I talked about that I think the best place for you to put persistence is in the data store. I told the tutors that I told you that's okay too. Made a big post about it in our team. And that's just because, like, and this will be a recurring theme in iteration 3. There's this notion of like separation of concerns, or things that are logically similar should be grouped together and things that aren't similar should be grouped apart. And what we mean by that is, like, it makes sense that your server.ts is concerned with things like request and response and JSON and stuff like that, and paths and query strings and bodies, and your auth.ts is not concerned with that. Your auth.ts should be kind of stripped away of all the HTTP nonsense as much as possible. And similarly, your auth.ts should describe how the application behaves, and the server.ts should do as little application-specific understanding of your program as possible, right? Because, like, you have a job here which is managing the HTTP layer. You have a job here which is trying to have your program follow a series of rules about how to behave. And similarly, over here you have a data store whose whole job it is to load up information and save information and collect information, and then that should be dealt with too. I'd say the two most logical places for persistence are either in server.ts, because server.ts is also, because your project's so small, your server.ts is naturally to your, how would you put it? Like your main file, where everything starts from. But also your data store is concerned with data too. So I would consider one of those two places to be fine. Oh, sorry. I think I've screwed something up here. So Ghost Blade has said, yeah, I think it's params, not path. That's my bad for this here. I think it's params. Apologies. I feel like it is. I'll just triple check. Yeah, there's no request. Okay, so request.path is it's the actual path. So what I mean by that is, if you would use request.path by doing this, you would say console log request.path, and that will actually give you this thing made concrete. So if someone called your particular route with foo bar Hayden, calling request.path would return you foo bar Hayden, the string. If you're actually trying to access something from the path, one of the parameters of the path, then you access it with .param. So thank you for picking up on that. That's important. Ghost of Blade says, are we allowed to modify get data and set data to read and write from a JSON file for persistence? Yes. Yes. You are. I can't see. Oh yeah, that's fine. There's no issues with that. I think that's what we talked about in week 5. The whole data store thing it's a bit of a relic back from when the course was in Python, and Python has some weird behaviors to do with global variables, which is probably a good thing, but it made that pattern really difficult to work with, and I think it just carried over. I don't even know why it carried over. It's probably because students find it easier to have a notion of a file with data in it, whereas if you didn't give them that, it's a little bit weird how to store stuff. But yeah, that's totally fine to modify that. Yenlin says, hey Hayden, I know this isn't 1531 content, but what's your view coding on a MacBook Air versus a MacBook Pro? I don't know. MacBook Pros are pretty powerful, but most things we do aren't too heavy. Compilation and stuff is a lot faster on a MacBook Pro, or working with big complicated applications, but the question's just how often are you doing that? Yeah, I'm not too sure. I don't love I find a lot of modern developments are really RAM heavy, is something I'd say. If you're working on websites these days, it's very difficult if you're someone who's using Spotify and Instagram and all that stuff on your computer. and doing a lot of web development programming to have not a lot of RAM. So I'd say like it wouldn't really matter that much the form factor of the laptop. It's more probably how much RAM it has. A lot of development's crazy how much memory it needs to use. Even deployed servers now use huge amounts of memory. You could, like your really simple application would probably need a server that has at least 4 gigabytes of RAM just to run, probably run the front end in particular. So it's an interesting question. But yeah, I'm not. I grew up with Windows. I only have this Mac for work, so I have a very narrow view of things. Yep.
Do we need tests for persistence?
No, because that's kind of what clear's for. The persistence really is only added to the course to like we know that life's going to be easier if you save stuff, and then we think, oh well, why don't we turn that into a 10-minute lecture about what saving even is philosophically? That's the extent of it. So there's nothing really to do with testing and things like that. Giselle, I think that's how I pronounce it. How can we check if time last edited is updated for a trashed quiz? Initially, we would think to use admin quiz info, but since you can't access non-existing quizzes, is there an alternative? I don't think so. So, I mean, this question's interesting because if I trash a quiz, actually, do we say you have to update? Let me just start reading that. Trash a quiz. Trash a quiz. Or is it delete quiz? Empty the trash. Delete a quiz. Okay. Yeah, okay. Again, you're all very smart. Look, that's a great forum question. If you can maybe post that, just because I don't run the auto marker at the moment, so you could literally just copy and paste that onto the forum. But unless there's something I'm missing, that could just be a case where, like, because when we write the spec, right, we just look at all the functions that modify a quiz and we just copy and paste that line into it. And it's really going to come down to, like, if you can't check it, then an auto marker can't check it. So if it's actually impossible to check because there is the spec, I know the one that says that you can't access a trashed quiz, that it means who wrote the auto marker isn't able to check it either, and it comes back to that question we made before that's like, you can't tell. But what's different about your question, which I think is important, is that the other questions were just like a what if, whereas this one actually explicitly asks you to do something which seems like you can't check it. So it's a great question for the forum. I suspect we probably don't auto mark it, and it's probably just something we'd remove, because again, if you come to quiz details, where is it? There'll be something about, oh wait, can you get it? Admin quiz info. Maybe it works. I mean, you can't access non-existing quizzes. This doesn't look like it throws an error if you try and access the quiz. So maybe it's okay. But yeah, again, like I don't kind of run the spec exactly myself, and it's quite a nuanced question. But at a glance, it seems like you should be able to get info from a trashed quiz. Yeah, hopefully. I know that's a half answer, so apologies if that's not immediately helpful. Slido question. I'm thinking about doing the course COMP1531 since it seems like a skill employers would look out for but don't intend to work on front end. Is it still worth doing? The course COMP1531 is like building the front end for the 2-hack quiz, right? So you've played around with the front end of the 2-hack quiz, or you've seen the website where you can use one. You know, that particular course is being referenced as all about that, doing that stuff. I can't imagine, like if you didn't want to work with front end, I can't imagine why that would be very useful to you. I don't know any company that wouldn't have you working with front end that would care if you know that stuff. You know, like it's the same with AI. Like most people get jobs not in AI, and yeah, AI is a really hot skill, but like no one cares if you know anything about it. If no one would care whether you know anything about it or not if they're not asking you to do something about it. So I'd probably say if it's not your interest, go do something else instead. Unless it's, you know, unless you're just kind of bored, then you could do it. But yeah, I don't think that would impact employment in an area that's unrelated to that piece of work. Yep.
If we were to import any new libraries, we place it in dependencies or dependencies in the package on JSON.
Okay, if you're using a new library, do you place it in dev dependencies or dependencies? It's probably a very difficult thing to tell, I think, for a typical student, because like once you've started to deploy your work, it becomes really obvious which one it is. I think the big question is like, is this dependency required to run the application, or is it just required for me to like develop on it? As in, like, you could think about, okay, if I got rid of jest or I got rid of linting, would the app still run and work? Yes. So it's a dev dependency. Whereas if I got rid of TypeScript's a bit in the middle. It's a hard one. But if I got rid of Express, would the app still run? No. So it's a normal dependency. I'd say that way of thinking will get you pretty far with it. And if you're not sure, you could ask. TypeScript's a funny one because the code's in TypeScript. So it probably would be, it is a dependency because, you know, when you go to run it, since the code's written in TypeScript, you need TypeScript to interpret it. If that makes sense. What's the library you're thinking about? Yeah, so a color generator library probably would be a normal dependency because without it, you can't generate the color for the user, right? Whereas some people might install an NPM library that changes the color of the terminal or something like that, in which case it is a, you know, dev dependency. So it's a good question too. We're all starting to get quite distracted and restless. So if you do have any other questions, can we post them now, and we'll just do a big sweep through what's left. I love how motivated you are by your iteration 2 work. It's good. Who's worried about the iteration 2 deadline? Okay, okay, a few people. Has anyone found, because this is true, some people are in like groups of 3 and they kind of are like, I wish I was in a group of 5 where we had more people. But I try and remind them that what we've seen for years now is that groups of 5 don't always do better because you've got lots of people. Is anyone finding in these last hours that like having all these people with disparate things, it's hard to glue it together? A couple of people. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's very hard to beat a group of 5 who are like all friends somehow and like hang out all the time and are just like getting stuff done. Those things are powerhouses. But in general, we find a typical group of 5, whilst there are more people to help, in these like deadline things, it's like someone's got to finish that, but they can't work till tonight, and then like it's the organization chaos roughly compensates for the reduced person load, I find. Questions on the Slido, on the YouTube? Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Especially when you set everyone to have you do this, you do this, you do this. It adds to that extra layer of like.
Yeah, it's more people to sync up with too. Yeah.
Absolutely. And like a lot of this stuff, I don't think anyone here's probably ever done a 9-week long.
Yeah.
5-person group project. That's a lot of management, especially for like a.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'd say my experience is that iteration 3 generally benefits slightly larger groups, and iteration 2 benefits slightly smaller groups, assuming you have an average group. And that's just because in iteration 3, the work is a little bit more divide and conquerable. There's kind of like this feature and that feature that you can kind of send people off by themselves with if you need to. Whereas iteration 2 is a lot of just like fumbling on, like all the question stuff is heavily related to each other. So if anyone is in a large group at the moment and you're feeling that overhead of the size, hopefully it's a little bit easier going forward. I have another question on the chat. Let me just sort this so I can see it. I have a question about that. After I have learning the 1531, can I choose the 4920 in third terms? Thank you. I don't know. COMP1531 is ethics or something like that. Management and ethics, there'll be a rule for it. Prerequisites 2511 and completion of 96 units of credit. So what's a unit of credit? It's like, what do you do, 8 a year or something by 6? That's 2 years. They're basically saying you have to have studied 2 years worth of courses. So that's 8 courses a year for 2 years, or 16 courses, 16 regular courses. And you have to have completed 2511, which is a course after this. So to your question about after you learn this, can I do 4920 in third term? Probably not, unless you've somehow managed to do 2511 at the same time, which is doubtful because you would have to get someone to approve it, and if this is your third year of uni. You basically can't do 4920 in your first or second year unless you somehow did some wacky stuff where you like overloaded and did 3 courses a term and stuff like that. So yeah, no, as far as I know, but I'm not a program director, but I think these websites are usually quite, I mean, go read this where it says there's a more recent version of it. Okay. There you go. There is a more recent version of it. 18 units of credit. Maybe you're in luck. You know, this is why you don't listen to me about course program things, because they change all the time. That's quite a big gap. I didn't realize. That does make me suspicious though, because that sounds like you could do it in your third term of first year. Maybe they've just changed what the course is about. Again, I don't know, but handbook's a great place. Go to student services. There's no real things like school offices anymore, so you just have to go to these, like, you know, the nucleus or that thing at the library, or send them an email or something like that. I'm really glad I kept clicking on that page. Oops. I don't know when we should use request.body and we should use request.query. All get and delete requests use request.query. All put and post requests use request.body. It's really that simple. So if there's a put or a post there, put, so I could run you through it real quick. Body, body, query, body, 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 query, body, query, body. Query, body, body, query, query, body, query. You know what I mean? Like, it's very deterministic. It's just like put and post, body, get and delete, query. I believe that's what the standard has. Most API clients won't let you send a body with get requests. Some of them will let you send a body with delete requests and stuff. It's all somewhat arbitrary. As we talked about back in week 4 though, the practical difference is that everything in the URL, which are your params, not path, and your query are all sniffable traffic, just like addresses and things on the outside of an envelope that you mail, whereas the body is what's inside the envelope that people can't open, in theory. Someone opened my mail last week and stole it though, so the mail analogy doesn't work too well. Any last questions?
Maybe a bit beyond the course, but like you said, I think last lecture you did work at Microsoft.
Yeah.
Beyond like a computer science degree, like what have you found working there that like is the most valuable thing? Because like my friend did a similar degree. He works at AWS now.
Yeah.
Down in Canberra, and he's got like a really fundamental knowledge. He says a lot of people he work with doesn't really have that, and they just kind of get by.
Yeah.
So like, is it teamwork like really crucial for work outside, you know, of uni? Or
Is the question basically like, what's the things that denote the biggest gap between what we get skilled at uni versus the workplace?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on a soft skill level, working with people is massive. I'd say like the areas that uni really differs the most are that virtually nearly everything you do at uni is by yourself, which is wild. On a technical sense, we learn very little about concurrency at uni. We learn very little about databases at uni. We learn very little about user interfaces at uni. They're probably the three biggest things I say that like people just typically deal with day to day. A lot of people in industry are dealing with some kind of interface, with some kind of database. And concurrency, probably more at the larger orgs that are doing complicated stuff like Amazon and Google. Because they're running, you know, all these servers in the cloud that are talking to each other. But yeah, teamwork's a massive thing. You know, just being a pleasant human is like a hard thing. Because like, you know, there's this thing that, there's a funny thing at uni where a lot of students like get in this mindset of like, how do I get a job? You know, like I have to skill myself up to get a job. But there's like a really interesting next step, which we often miss, which is like, once you have that job, how do you prepare yourself to like actually excel at that job? And sometimes they can be very different things. Like a really good example is like people in student societies, right? Is anyone part of a student society, whether you're running it or you just hang out, like go to an event once a month and see people? Got like, I'm sure a few of you do. Lazy little crap sometimes in this lecture, aren't you? It's things like that, they never actually help you get a job, you know? Like no one really is going to care if you're part of like TSOC, drinking tea every month or something like that. Hope no one's in TSOC. What didn't mean that offensively. But you know, all those little interactions you have at uni that help you work with other people or like talk to them or think about an organization, they translate very well in industry. So there's lots of friends I know that have like a lot more general skill set with things like working with other people and understanding, you know, how to make people enjoy working with them and how an organization works. And they'll get the same job as someone else, but they'll get promoted like 3 times faster. So yeah, teamwork's a huge one, I think. Because I got reminded of this a while ago, which is like particularly when you're being interviewed in like any organization that's not absolutely massive, at the end of the day, you got to remember people are asking themselves the question of whether they can put up with you, you know? Like, because when you hire someone in a team, that person is thinking like, okay, this random person I've just met, do I want to literally have them sit next to me or be in my Slack Discord channel like every day for years, you know? So there are these like kind of interesting tragic elements of like, it's not just about competency, it's about just seeming like a pleasant human. And that doesn't mean that you have to be like fun or charming. It just means like, you know, when you meet someone and you're just like, who wouldn't like that person? You know, like they seem just like a nice person who seems easy to get along with. There are elements of that for sure. It was a bit of a long answer, but hopefully that's good. I'm going to jump into another technical question. Delete part is mean that we should put everything into a file named trash or just clear it. 10 points for expression on that one. I kind of love these questions. They're so to the point, which makes me happy. So delete says sends quiz to trash. So this thing about put it into a file named trash. So I just want to be careful with this question. There is no file named trash. How this actually translates in reality is that it's likely that your quiz, and this is probably how most groups have done it, some would do it a few other ways maybe, is each quiz you have will have a Boolean on it to basically determine whether it's in trash or not. You know, some people might have a quiz list and then a trash quiz list, and they might move things to that list as well. They would be the two ones that would come to my mind that I would think people will use. Both are fine. Some have benefits. Moving is more complicated than trash, but if you have two separate lists, it makes the fetching of a list of quizzes easier, right? And it makes emptying a quiz marginally easier, but both are the same. So when you say, is the delete part mean that we should just put everything into a file named trash or clear it? It's not really the clear it part. We shouldn't be deleting anything when we put it in the trash, but what we should be doing is changing a Boolean on it or moving it to another array. Because remember, whether you're on Windows or Mac, when you delete a file on your computer, you don't actually gain any free space on your computer because they don't get rid of that. They just go and take it from here and put it over in this bucket here. And it's only when you empty that recycling bin, and you can do this with your own computer, will you actually see space come back on your computer. It's the same principle here. So, and it's a great question too, whoever asked it, because it is one of the only things about these iteration 1 routes that is different in behavior to iteration 1. Because in iteration 1, delete actually deleted it. Then all these other routes here, you could pretty much reuse your code verbatim, except this one you do need to modify it slightly. So it's good that you've identified that as a question, because there is something to change there. Anything else? It's the last time I'm going to awkwardly stand here and ask. I've never cracked it yet after all these years, why it's like there's something about the psychology of people that they don't want to ask a question until absolutely the very last second. And then these things just become that on repeat. So last time I'll ask for the next 60 seconds. Ask in person, ask on the Slido, or ask on the YouTube. Yep.
For the situation, change the way that into one functions work, where
Yep.
instead of like just the expected results like empty object or whatever, we have it contain an object of the status code and the actual intended object. Basically to simplify the actual like logic for the error checks in the server. So is that allowed or?
Yes, we actually have we have some more thorough requirements on that for iteration 3, but for iteration 2 it's like totally fine, which is normal because a part of this course is about software design, and we actually embrace that between iterations there's always going to be code to refactor, because that's actually one of the best areas we all learn how to program, is when we have to change our code. That makes us think about what we've written more than anything else. So I'd say that, without giving away too much, there will be some modifications that might have to be made to that approach, but from the iteration 2 perspective, there's no issue with that at all. So totally fine.
Cool. In like the previous iteration, when you're like writing code for like auth.js, and
Yep.
you're writing the test one as well, they obviously want you to like merge the test stuff first, and then merge the actual code afterwards.
Yep.
Doing the tests for this one, like you need to make changes to like auth.test.ts, and then also change files in server.ts in order for those to work. I was having a bit of a discussion with my coworker because I thought that you should push them at the same time because one requires the other, but he was very much push the tests and then push the server.ts, but I didn't want to do that because that would fail the pipeline on GitLab.
Yeah.
The tutors talked about is making sure that you push the tests first and then the other stuff later.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think also this course is going to be unnaturally dogmatic just because we're trying to instill principles, right? But the distinction of committing and pushing is pretty important, right? Committing your tests and then committing your implementation, but pushing them together is fine. Pushing as a concept is kind of irrelevant. Like at the end of the day, pushing is just the moment you decide to sync your history with Git history. It's all the committing that matters. So as long as you commit tests and then you commit your implementation, that's totally fine. Yeah, because there's no reason to push so frequently. I mean, you don't ever really need to push unless someone else needs to see it, or if no one else needs to see it, we push so that in case our computer blows up. Like I've literally had like 3 months ago, I had a developer do 5 hours of work, and then he accidentally Git reset his entire day worth of work, and he just had committed, like he hadn't committed or pushed anything, and it didn't matter because no one was needing that piece of work for a while. So that's a case where he committed and pushed, or could just to, nothing was like lost. But in general, yeah, pushing less frequently than committing is totally fine. Yeah. There's a question here: if I just do lab and iteration 0 to 2, can I pass the class? Oh yeah, I mean, do the math. There's nothing really that I'm bringing to that. Yes, that's fine. I don't really have anything else to add to that. I mean, You can do a lot of pass the class in many different ways. You can do no labs and pass the class and things like that. The only thing I'd ever say is like, and this is a really obscure thing, but this is the last question I guess we're answering today. The only time you got to be careful with that stuff is if you ever want to apply for fee remission or something. So let's imagine you don't do any labs for the term, and then for some reason you claim that there was a disaster happened to you in week 9 and you had to drop the course, and then you email the uni and you say, can I have my money back, because there's some extenuating circumstances. The unis do contact the lecturers and ask for things like, did this person actually turn up to class? Like, are they just pulling our leg? Like, did they actually just do really bad and they want to dive out and get their money back? Or were they actually like a decent student who like turned up and did the work, and therefore like, just crap happens to them? But that's an extremely like once every 5 year kind of problem. That's maybe a risk of just randomly not doing assessments, but largely you can do what you want. Obviously don't be a douchebag to your group members and stuff. Like if you were just like, I want to check out after iteration 2, if you just said to your group and your group members like, I have now passed the course, I am out of here, I will be doing no work for iteration 3, I know I'll be getting a 0, continue on without me, that's probably the most respectful thing you can do. But as always, I would cautiously advise you that you better be very sure your mark is final, because there's always instances where like a tutor accidentally gave you a mark and they misunderstood how much work you'd done, particularly if you didn't do as much as some other members in your group. Sometimes it takes us a few weeks to figure that out, and then we can retroactively lower your mark and stuff. So if you're a bad group member who got a 50 in iteration 2, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't dive out and disappear. I'd keep going. Keep going in general, but it's an interesting question. Anyway, questions are coming to an end. I don't want to keep asking and sitting here for a few minutes waiting. So let's wrap up. Thank you. Really happy with all the stuff that was asked today, really engaged, and good luck with iteration 2. I'll see you next week when we loop into some more content. Cool, thanks everyone.